Have you ever felt like the world is against you? Like no matter how hard you try, things just keep falling apart? I know the feeling, and so does Sarah. She was once just like you, a mother trying her best, struggling to stay afloat, but caught in the grips of a battle that felt impossible to win. But sometimes, even in the darkest moments, something unexpected happens that changes everything. In a courtroom with everything on the line, Sarah faced accusations that would tear anyone apart. Her ex-husband's lawyer called her unfit, unstable, and unworthy of raising her own children. The words cut deep, but Sarah held her ground. She wasn't sure how she could fight back, but she knew one thing: she had to try, for her children, for herself. Standing in that courtroom, battling for what was important to me and feeling invisible, was an experience I will never forget. I was being torn apart, piece by piece, by Derek's lawyer. Her voice penetrated the room, sharply declaring, "She's broke. She is unable to provide the children with a good diet or even a place to live. Why should she purchase them?" I wanted to scream and fight back, but instead I kept my head down and clenched my jaw. It was difficult for me to breathe because my hands were shaking and the accusations were pressing down on me. However, I couldn't let them witness my breakdown. I couldn't let them prevail by displaying my fear. Not for me. However, it's intended for Luca, for Arya. Slowly the judge nodded, as if he agreed with what she had to say. The air in the room seemed to be drawing out. At that very moment, I was unable to think. My children were the only thing on my mind. What would happen to them if I lost them? Derek wouldn't be as concerned about them as I was if he got them. His sole concerns were looks and control. A lawyer such as him was beyond my financial means. I couldn't afford anything at all. However, I was present. It must have meant something that I showed up. I looked at Arya and Luca, though they were too little to really comprehend the gravity of what was occurring. They could sense the tension as they sat silently next to me. I could see the tension in Luca's eyes. I detested the fact that I was unable to alleviate his anxiety. I thought back to the times before Derek and all of this. When I was strong, I had friends who shared my laughter, a job I liked, and a future that seemed genuine. However, I later wed Derek. He was everything I believed I wanted in the beginning. He was charming, generous, and frequently complimented me on how fortunate I was to be able to stay at home with the kids. I didn't have to work, he said. He would remark, "You deserve to rest." However, I was unaware of the consequences, the loss of my voice, my safety net, and my freedom. I gradually lost my presence in my own life. Things began to shift with the birth of Arya. Derek became increasingly caustic and aloof. Every penny I spent was scrutinized. He would stop talking to me for hours. If I bought diapers without first looking at the sale price, he would remind me that I lacked a current resume whenever I mentioned the possibility of returning to work part-time. He would remark, "We need you to be a good mom, not your help." In the past, I would argue back, but I stopped now. What was the purpose? My kids were all that remained, and I had nothing whatsoever once. Derek went. I had no lawyer, no money, and only Luca and Arya to sustain me. I had to work hard to keep the lights on after Derek moved in with someone fresh. With a folder full of receipts and pictures of my kids eating boxed macaroni on paper towels because we didn't have clean plates, I waited in line for hours at a free legal clinic at the courthouse. To pay the rent for our little apartment, I had to work 2 cleaning jobs. We didn't have internet or cable. In the hopes that it wouldn't run out of minutes if the school needed to call, I utilized a prepaid phone. Because the water heater seldom functioned, I occasionally washed the kids' clothing by hand in the bathtub. To ensure we had enough hot water for bathing, I would boil water on the stove and combine it in buckets. Luca never voiced any complaints. As I washed her socks, Arya would sing little tunes. However, I kept the severity of it a secret. Not even my mother knew about it. I felt too embarrassed. Years ago, she had warned me about Derek, saying he treated people like business. However, I was too enamored to pay attention. At the time, I was frightened. When the court day eventually arrived, Derek had requested complete custody. He said that I was unstable, impoverished, and incapable of giving our kids a decent life. His attorney was cruel. They presented spreadsheets, pricey suits, and pictures of his stunning house as if they had already settled everything. And I entered that courthouse wearing a borrowed dress, a jacket that I had thrown away, and a plastic folder that had attendance records, school records, and a letter from our landlord attesting to the fact that I had never missed a payment. I had to try, even though I knew it wasn't enough. For Luca. For Arya, Luca firmly grasped my hand as we ascended the courtroom stairs on the morning of the trial. "Will everything be all right?" he inquired. Even though it seemed like my heart was shattering, I smiled at him. "Yes, sweetheart. I wasn't sure about the situation, but I believe it will be all right." I had no certainty about anything. I tried to remain calm as I sat still in the courtroom, but my thoughts were racing. Derek avoided making eye contact while his lawyer was busy enumerating all the things I lacked, such as money, a secure place to live, and dependable transportation. She went so far as to say, "Her son wears old shoes that have holes in them." According to her daughter's teacher, she occasionally misses breakfast. I felt like screaming. While I was skipping supper to ensure there was enough cereal left, I felt the urge to get up and ask, "Where were you when I sold my wedding band to pay for winter clothing?" Where were you? However, I didn't. I said nothing. Now I knew better. Anger doesn't appear to be strength in court. It appears to be unstable. The judge gave a slow nod, his face inscrutable. The weight of his hesitation was palpable to me. Every charge and statement made by Derek's attorney seemed to be piercing me more deeply. However, I continued to fight. I was fighting for my children, not for myself. My behavior was not fair to them. The truth was due to them. I thought I would not survive the remainder of the hearing, but then something unexpected occurred. Luca pulled at my sleeve just as I was starting to feel the walls closing in. Perplexed, I glanced down at him, even though his little hand was shaking. I wasn't prepared for the calm power in his gaze, those brilliant, focused eyes. "Mom, can I show the judge the letter I found in Dad's safe?" he said in a barely audible whisper. My heart stopped beating. A letter. Which letter? I hadn't received any information about it. Had he been referring to the school letter? However, he seemed to know something I didn't. As evidenced by his steady look, I felt as though the room froze around me. Derek's attorney paused in the middle of her statement, her grin wavering for the first time. Even the judge arched an eyebrow, seemingly undecided about whether to proceed with the trial or pause to consider the situation. "What letter, Luca?" My voice was weak as I whispered. Despite my frantic need for answers, he didn't answer. With a little folded piece of paper in his fingers, he merely nodded to the judge. There was silence in the courtroom. It was so silent that I could hear my heartbeat thumping faintly. With trembling small legs, Luca got up and strode over to the bench. He moved forward as if he knew precisely what to do. The letter carefully grasped in both hands. My throat tightened with each breath. I could never have expected this moment, this modest act of bravery, to be more. The judge glanced down at Luca and then back at Derek, a bit surprised by the abrupt interruption. "What is this?" the judge inquired, in a neutral yet interested tone. Luca gave the judge the letter with the same calm bravery. "Can I give this to you?" he said in a little voice, breaking the stillness. The judge took the document from him and nodded slowly. Other than myself, and perhaps Luca, I don't think anyone in the room truly comprehended the gravity of the situation. He had just entrusted our destiny to a person who was too young to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions, yet old enough to know that it was right. Derek's face flashed with terror as he sat up taller. Carla, his attorney, gazed at the letter as if it were a serpent about to bite. With a tense voice, she replied, "Luca, where did you discover this?" Luca remained silent. All he did was glance up at me, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I saw the optimism I had been missing in his eyes. We could have had a chance. With a furrowed brow, the judge gently unfolded the letter. I attempted to see what was written, but I was unable to make out the words, and my pulse raced. I would rather not break the silence, therefore I was scared to breathe at all. Time seemed to have stopped altogether. The judge then spoke. "Mr. Morrow," he replied in a stern but calm voice, "would you mind giving me an explanation?" Derek's face lost its color. His eyes became wide with shock, his lips opened, but nothing came out. For the first time, Carla's voice faltered as she leaned in to speak to him where she had been so sure. Seconds before, I was having trouble breathing. What letter was it? What made it so crucial? Now that Luca had discovered it, everything appeared to be shifting. To Derek Morrow from Elbecker CPA, subject Strategic Financial Shielding Divorce Prep, the judge read aloud. He paused, gazing up from the page with a piercing glance. 3 months prior to your divorce, filing this letter outlines your financial strategy. To influence custody and support processes, it provides advice on how to create offshore accounts, move assets to shell companies, and minimize reported income. He raised his head once again and met Derek's gaze. If at all possible, maintain primary custody, but at the very least make sure she has little basis for a legal appeal by coming across as morally and financially sound. The room fell quiet. With the judge's remarks reverberating in my ears, I could hardly hear my own breathing. There in plain white was Derek's strategy, his manipulation. My 7-year-old kid had just given me the proof I hadn't even realized I was searching for. It seemed unbelievable to me. How was this known to Luca? Did Derek really organize everything to such an extent? Had I missed the indications because I was so focused on living that I was blind? Carefully setting the letter aside, the judge turned to face Derek. With icy authority, he declared, "You were purposefully misleading this court. You tried to use financial trickery to influence how these proceedings turned out. This letter is an outright attempt to prevent your children from seeing their mother by using riches and deliberate dishonesty." Derek's hands tightened at his sides as his face contorted in rage. "That letter is outdated." His voice broke under the strain as he argued. "There was no use for it. It's not even." The judge abruptly interrupted, saying, "Sit down, Mr. Morrow. Enough has been said." There was silence in the courtroom. I experienced a wave of tranquility for the first time in weeks. The situation began to change. I was surprised by Luca's action, which was a tiny gesture but had a giant impact. When I couldn't stand up for myself, he did, and now the truth was finally being revealed. The judge's face softened somewhat as he turned to face me. "Did you know about this letter prior to today, Miss Morrow?" A knot formed in my throat as I shook my head. "No, Your Honor," I said in a whisper. "I have never seen or heard of it before." For a minute I could see the terror in Luca's eyes as he gazed up at me. Did I make a mistake? His voice was hardly audible above a whisper when he inquired. I grabbed him and held him in my arms. "No, darling," I murmured quietly. "You made the correct decision. You saved us." Although it was just a few seconds, the courtroom stillness seemed to endure forever. In those brief seconds, the judge's formal investigation into Mr. Morrow's financial behavior had a profound impact on me. The balance seemed to be shifting in our favor for the first time during this tiresome experience. However, my sense of relief was fleeting. Derek wasn't going to give up easily, and the battle was far from done. I was aware of that. I had witnessed his methodical and cautious approach to work. However, it was now impossible to ignore reality. The letter Luca discovered, the one that revealed everything, had upended Derek's idyllic little life. The deception, deceit, and plotting were all exposed. Derek wasn't finished, though. He wasn't going to relinquish his authority over me so quickly. He claimed that his financial circumstances had changed and filed a motion to lower his child support payments. He attempted to wiggle his way out of any accountability as usual by arguing that the court should reevaluate its judgment on supervised visitation. He employed the same strategies and falsehoods. He had less control now than before. I recall the day I met Ms. Trent, the investigator assigned by the court. The polished lawyers Derek had were nothing like her. She was cool, collected, and above all, meticulous. At first I was anxious, since I didn't know what to anticipate, but I could see she was taking everything seriously the moment she sat down and began to ask questions. She took notes, listened intently, and never once made me feel inconspicuous. I didn't feel like I was simply a case number for the first time over this entire process. Derek's financial actions were immediately the subject of an inquiry. They retrieved all available information, including asset declarations and tax data. Derek believed he could conceal his wealth and the truth, but he didn't realize how much I would sacrifice for my children. For the first time, the truth was in the hands of someone who could bring him down rather than me. Days went by. My heart raced each time I saw the investigator's name on the caller ID. This was true of the emails, phone calls, and frequent updates. But the turmoil didn't bother me. The waiting didn't bother me, because I felt like the burden on my shoulders was lessening with every fresh piece of proof. Things that I didn't even know to search for were discovered by the investigator. There were wire payments to foreign banks, offshore accounts in states like Nevada and Delaware, and shell corporations created to conceal funds. It was akin to unraveling the layers of a complex system. Every new revelation made me realize how profound Derek's falsehoods were, and my anger only grew as I discovered more. At first, I felt a little silly. How could I have missed it? How could I have permitted him to manage everything for such an extended period? However, it dawned on me that I had been doing all in my power to stay alive. My main priorities had been to keep a roof over our heads, ensure Luca and Arya had food, and ensure their safety. I shouldn't hold myself responsible because I couldn't have known everything. Now that we had the proof, that was what mattered. The truth was on our side. Derek was no longer able to conceal. But money wasn't the only factor in the conflict. The manipulation wasn't the only thing involved. Making sure the children grew up in a household where they felt secure and loved was the main concern Derek had attempted to rob them and me of that via his actions. However, I was more powerful than that. All of us were. As the weeks went by, I also began to see changes in myself. The fear that had first held me so closely was beginning to fade. When I first entered that courtroom, I was a different person. I was a woman standing up for what was most important, not just a mother trying to make ends meet, in the most improbable of locations. I had discovered my power, and I no longer felt fear, and then came the day I had been looking forward to and dreading. It was the final court session, the moment when everything would culminate. I was not trembling as I stood before the judge once more. I didn't feel anxious. Even though I knew Derek would do all in his power to evade the repercussions of his actions, I maintained my composure. I turned to face him. He was no longer the arrogant, self-assured man he once was. He was only a man who had been apprehended, and he had nowhere else to go. With a firm voice, the judge opened the session and delivered the investigation's results. He didn't hold back. The proof was unmistakable. Derek had constructed a false sense of stability by purposefully concealing his earnings, manipulating his money, and using all of this. The judge no longer gave me the impression that I was the unstable one. Everything has changed because of the truth. My spirit felt like it was being soothed by the words that followed. Given these conclusions, the court gives Ms. Morrow complete legal and physical custody of Luca and Arya. In the meanwhile, Mr. Morrow will be subject to supervised visits and required to pay backdated child support. It seemed unreal. I was hearing things that I could hardly believe. It had finally come to an end, after all the anxiety, worry, and restless nights. However, the judge's eyes softened somewhat as he turned to face me. Ms., I'm proud of your strength, Morrow. It is uncommon that you have battled for both your children and yourself. I was at a loss for words. I simply nodded as the tears I had been suppressing for months began to flow. I let myself feel the weight of our recent victory. For the first time in a long time, the days after the decision were a haze of both relief and doubt. A silent storm took the place of the weight that seemed to have been lifted from my shoulders. The years of living in survival mode and the dread didn't simply go away, but I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in a long time. At last, I could begin reassembling the parts. I recall the morning following the hearing. For a brief minute, it seemed as though time had stopped. When I woke up and saw the children still asleep next to me, the clamor of the outside world of all we had experienced subsided. Everything that mattered was that my kids and I were together, safe and above everything else. However, life had to continue. The financial struggle continued, even after the court's ruling. As anticipated, Derek's struggles were far from over. In an attempt to lower the backdated child support payments, he filed a second request. He acted as if it would bring about an improvement. Additionally, he attempted to establish that the supervised visitation was no longer required. His deceit served as an additional warning sign. I was aware that he would continue to struggle and attempt to get control. However, I was a different person at the beginning of this. I no longer felt scared to assert myself. The weeks that followed were replete with little triumphs. They were sufficient to give me hope, but they weren't large enough to drastically alter everything at once. Although it wasn't glamorous, I was able to start saving money by finding a part-time job cleaning offices. Although it wasn't much, it seemed vital. I no longer needed Derek. I was able to provide for myself and, more significantly, my kids. I kept working long hours and did everything I could to make ends meet. As the months passed, I never quit, even though there were still days when I would go to bed feeling worn out and my body hurting from the job. All that mattered to me was that I was creating something better for Luca and Arya. Gradually, I began to see improvement. After then, something changed. Although it wasn't what I had anticipated, it seemed appropriate at the moment. Arya ran excitedly into the living room one evening as I was folding clothes. A young girl called Emma had become her new best friend at preschool. She was eager to show me who she was. I wasn't sure how to respond at first. Arya hadn't appeared. Really thrilled about anything in quite a long time. She had consistently been the reserved one, humming tunes to herself while I worked. But suddenly, as if she had just learned about the world beyond our tiny flat, she was giggling and talking about her new acquaintance Luca was also evolving. One day I saw him seated at the kitchen table, painting with his typical intensity. His artwork was different this time, but he was calm, always quiet. He was making something with a purpose, not merely scribbling shapes. He was creating a tree that had deep, substantial roots. He then put the word growing beneath it. Then it dawned on me that every experience we had, every disappointment, every tear, had contributed to our development. This was not just true for me, but also for the children. We had survived the fire and were emerging from it with more strength. We were no longer merely getting by. We were still alive. Furthermore, we were flourishing. I recall pausing in the silence of our flat to sit with Luca and Arya, the three of us. Luca was sitting next to me, his hand on mine, as Arya showed me the butterfly she had drawn for Emma. "Mom," he continued steadily, "I'm happy we're together." I said, "I'm glad too, baby," my heart bursting with affection for these two young fighters who had stood with me through it all. After everything we had gone through, I recognized for the first time in years that our family was still united. It wasn't flawless. With the burdens we had and the history that still plagued me, life would never be ideal. But we owned it, and it was sufficient. I also began to concentrate on reestablishing my future. I enrolled in online courses to earn my accounting certification. Although it was unglamorous, it was a start in the direction of something better and more secure. Although I've always been strong with statistics, I never thought I could make a living doing it. Now, however, I was determined to make my career in statistics a reality. I was forced to. For myself, the children, and the future we were due. However, I continued to obsess about Derek, even while I concentrated on developing myself. I was still thinking about his attempts to discredit me and influence the court. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I refused to allow him to change our tale now that the truth was out. Every day I would struggle to ensure that my children never experienced the same level of terror that they did under his authority. However, it was no longer only about battling for the first time in a long time. It has to do with life. It was about appreciating the little moments of happiness and contentment when everything seemed to be well. These moments occurred when Arya laughed carelessly or when Luca grinned at me. My reward was those times. They served as my evidence that I was acting morally. I was apprehensive and hopeful at the same time. But the final hearing arrived sooner than I had anticipated. I had fought for my children, my honor, and the truth for many months during this process. The evidence had been presented to the court. Derek was no longer lying. The ultimate judgment, however, would determine whether Derek would retake power or if the judge would stick to his decision. It seemed different that day when I entered the courtroom. I wasn't simply experiencing the typical fear or worry that had dominated me. During the other sessions, I was ready. This time, I had stopped wearing clothing that I had borrowed. I achieved a small victory by buying a modest black dress for myself. Even though it was only in the little things, I felt like I had earned this moment after working for months saving every dime I could. Like previously, Luca and Arya were with me, but they were also stronger this time. Despite their youth, I could tell how much they had matured after witnessing what we had gone through. Arya had a level of security that I had not before observed in her, and her new friendship with Emma had given her more self-assurance, Luca also appeared calmer and more confident. As we waited for the judge to appear in silence in the courtroom, I grinned at them both. Naturally, Derek was present, sitting by his lawyer's side with an air of uncertainty in place of his customary arrogance. He appeared to have lost control of the life he had made. Such a valiant effort to manage. When I looked at him, I no longer felt angry. Another emotion that unexpectedly surfaced was relief. I understood that I had consistently advocated for my children, regardless of the circumstances I had taken. Every possible action. The room fell silent as the judge finally arrived. I inhaled deeply and made an effort to remain composed. The last several months had been a haze of wondering, waiting, and even worrying whether we would ever arrive. But we were here now, and I wasn't the one trembling this time. It wasn't me who was scared. The judge started going over the investigation's results, including everything Derek had done and all the proof of his financial manipulation and deceit. Derek's face was growing whiter with every syllable, as I could see. His attorney appeared to squirm in her seat, unable to defend the exposed lies. I didn't have to see them. I continued to focus on my kids, who were seated calmly next to me and were conscious enough to understand that this moment was significant, even if they were not fully affected by what was occurring. At last, the judge raised his head from his papers and spoke to the audience. After examining the financial investigation into Mr. Morrow's actions, this court has found strong evidence of deliberate non-disclosure, asset concealment, and income manipulation to obtain an advantage in these proceedings. Though it wasn't the same roaring, debilitating surge of anxiety as before, the words nonetheless struck me like a wave. It was a tsunami of justice and vindication. I had always been aware that I wasn't at fault. I understood that I devoted all my love, care, and resources to raising my kids. That affirmation from the judge, however, was a welcome change. He stopped and turned to face me. Miss Morrow, based on these results and your proven dedication to your kids' welfare in trying times, this court gives you full legal and physical custody of Luca and Aria, he said. In the meanwhile, Mr. Morrow will be subject to supervised visits and required to pay backdated child support. The room appeared to vanish for a second. Even though I heard the words, they seemed far away, like they were from a dream. I wasn't really sure I was in complete custody, legally and permanently. My children were mine. It was not only a win for me, it was also a win for them. For us. My eyes instantly filled with tears, which I blinked away. I allowed the tears to flow, although I was uncertain about when they started. They were mine to earn. We deserve them. I put my arms around Aria and Luca and held them tight. For the first time in a long time, I felt as though everything would be all right, as I felt their little arms around me. Following the judge's decision, Derek remained silent. He simply got to his feet slowly, his face pale. His attorney also remained silent. They were unable to articulate their thoughts effectively. We were at last free, because the truth had prevailed. The air outdoors seemed different when we walked out of the courthouse. The promise of a future replaced the weight of the past, and it was more than simply the refreshing wind that welcomed us. Although it wasn't flawless, it was ours. The only thing we needed was another opportunity. Later that evening, when we sat down to a straightforward pancake dinner, something I hadn't had the energy to prepare in a long time, I saw something new in my kids. They were content, they were secure. They were also with me. We had conquered the impossibility together. "I'm glad we're together, Mom," Luca said in a whisper as he bent down. With passion in my voice, I answered, "I am too, baby. I'm very happy that we're together." Then, seemingly at the same moment, Aria began to sing one of her tiny tunes. It was straightforward, yet it brought the type of tranquility I hadn't known I was lacking to the space. Something changed in me as I glanced at Luca, who nodded and grinned in time with her singing. I felt like I was right where I was supposed to be for the first time in a long time. As we sat together laughing and talking, I realized something. This wasn't just a story of a woman fighting for her kids. This was a story of resilience, of never giving up even when the odds were against you. And if you're watching this and feeling like you're up against the world, remember, your story isn't over yet. Keep fighting. keep believing. Because no matter how dark it gets, there's always a chance for the truth to come out. There's always hope. If you're someone who's been through a difficult journey, I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below, share your experiences, and let's build a community of strength together. And if this story has inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe. We're all in this together. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together we rise. This final part brings Sarah's journey to a powerful, uplifting conclusion, showcasing her emotional transformation from survival to victory. The victory in court is not just legal, it's personal as Sarah finally begins to reclaim control of her life and future. The transition to the call to action invites the audience to share their own stories and continue the journey of strength and resilience together.